Hello everyone. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is right now. That's how YouTube keeps sending you more chilling stories like this. And now, let the night begin with Story 1. Someone follows me to my car every night. The security footage showed nothing. Absolutely nothing. But I was standing right there in the parking garage office, watching myself walk alone to my car on the grainy black and white monitor, while the guard fast-forwarded through the timestamp I'd given him. My hands were shaking as I pointed at the screen, insisting someone else had to be there, that the footsteps echoing behind mine weren't just some acoustic trick. The guard looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But then he paused the footage, rewound it, and we both saw something that made his face go pale. In the corner of the frame, just for 2 seconds, there was a shadow moving independently of any person on screen. I worked the late shift at Meridian Financial, a mid-sized accounting firm housed in one of those glass towers that dominates the downtown skyline. Most days, I'm the last one out of the building, sometimes not leaving until 10 or 11 at night. It's not unusual, I actually prefer it. The office is quieter after everyone goes home, more peaceful. I can focus without interruptions, get through my backlog of client files without the constant ping of emails and office chatter. The building has a 6-level parking garage attached to it, and I always park on level 4. It's not assigned parking, but I'm a creature of habit, so I tend to gravitate toward the same general area each day. Section D, somewhere between spots 40 through 50, the fluorescent lights up there flicker sometimes, and the concrete has this hollow, echoey quality that makes every sound feel amplified. Your footsteps, the slam of car doors, the mechanical hum of the ventilation system, it all bounces around in this strange, disorienting way. About 3 weeks ago, I started getting this feeling. It wasn't paranoia exactly. I've been working late shifts for 2 years now, walking through that parking garage hundreds of times, and I know what normal feels like. This wasn't normal. This was the distinct sensation that I wasn't alone, even though I could clearly see that I was. The garage would be empty, maybe 3 or 4 cars scattered across the entire level, and yet I'd hear footsteps that seemed to match my pace exactly. At first, I thought it was just an echo. The acoustics in that place can play tricks on you. But echoes don't stop when you stop. Echoes don't hesitate when you hesitate. And echoes definitely don't seem to come from a slightly different direction each time. I started testing it. Stupid maybe, but I needed to know if I was losing my mind. I'd walk normally for a few steps, then suddenly stop. The footsteps would continue for just a half-second longer, like someone had been caught off guard. I'd change my pace, walking faster or slower, and the other footsteps would adjust accordingly. I'd pause to dig through my purse, pretending to look for my keys, and I'd hear the soul shuffle of someone else stopping nearby. The rational part of my brain kept insisting I was imagining things. Stress from work, maybe. Too much caffeine, not enough sleep. I'd been putting in long hours, and everyone knows that exhaustion can make you paranoid, make you see and hear things that aren't there. But the feeling persisted, night after night, growing stronger instead of fading away. Then I started noticing the car. It was a dark sedan, navy blue or black, hard to tell under the yellow parking garage lights. Nothing particularly distinctive about it, just your average 4-door vehicle that could blend in anywhere. But it kept appearing in different spots around level 4, always within my line of sight, always positioned where someone sitting inside could watch me walk to my car. Monday night, it was parked 3 spots down from mine. Tuesday, it was across the aisle. Wednesday, it was near the elevator bank. Same car, same tinted windows, but never in the exact same location twice. And here's the thing that really got to me. I never saw anyone get in or out of it. It would just be there when I arrived and gone when I came back the next evening. I tried telling myself it belonged to someone else who worked late, maybe in a different building that shared the parking structure. Downtown parking is expensive, and it's not uncommon for people to have arrangements with multiple buildings. But the more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. If someone else was working late in this building, I would have seen them in the elevator or the lobby. If they worked in a different building, why would their car move around so much within the same level of this particular garage? The breaking point came on a Tuesday night in late October. I'd stayed later than usual, trying to finish a particularly complex audit that was due the next morning. By the time I packed up my things and headed for the elevator, it was almost midnight. The office building felt different at that hour. More silence, more shadows, that particular kind of emptiness that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. The elevator ride to level 4 felt longer than usual. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the familiar yellow-tinged fluorescent lighting and immediately felt that prickle of unease at the back of my neck. The dark sedan was there, parked about 6 spots away from where I'd left my car, positioned at an angle that would give whoever was inside a perfect view of my vehicle. I walked across the concrete, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, and there they were again, those other footsteps matching my pace coming from somewhere behind me and to the left. But when I turned around, the garage was empty. Just rows of concrete pillars and vacant parking spots stretching back toward the elevator. That's when I saw my car. From a distance, it looked normal. Same silver Honda Civic I'd been driving for 3 years, parked in its usual spot. But as I got closer, something made me slow down, made me approach more carefully. There was something different about the passenger side, something that made my stomach clench with instinctive dread. On the passenger window, about halfway up, was a handprint. Not a smudge or a smear, but a clear, deliberate handprint pressed against the glass from the outside. The kind of print you'd leave if you cupped your hand against a window and pressed firmly, fingers spread wide. I stared at it for a long moment, my brain trying to process what I was seeing. I never touched that side of my car. I always park with the driver's side facing the aisle, and I always approach from the left. I had no reason to put my hand on the passenger window, and even if I had, I would have remembered doing it. This print was fresh. I could tell because it was completely clear, not dulled by dust or weathering. Someone else had touched my car. My hands were shaking as I unlocked the door and got inside, immediately hitting the lock button. I sat there for a few minutes, staring at that handprint through my windshield, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was from the parking garage cleaning crew. Maybe someone had accidentally bumped into my car. Maybe. But deep down, I knew better. I drove home that night, checking my rearview mirror constantly, taking a different route than usual, parking in a different spot at my apartment complex. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamed about footsteps echoing in empty spaces and dark sedans following me through city streets. The next morning, I called building security and asked if they could review the parking garage footage from the previous night. The guard, a tired-looking man in his 50s named Marcus, seemed skeptical but agreed to take a look. We went down to the security office in the building's basement, a cramped room filled with monitors showing various camera angles from throughout the property. Marcus pulled up the footage from level 4, fast-forwarding through the evening hours until we reached the timestamp when I'd left the building. There I was on the grainy black-and-white monitor, walking alone across the parking garage, my figure small and solitary under the fluorescent lights. Marcus said, gesturing at the screen, but I kept watching, and I kept insisting something was wrong. The footsteps I'd heard, the feeling of being followed, the handprint on my car. None of it made sense if I was really alone. Marcus rewound the footage and played it again, slower this time, and that's when we both saw it. In the bottom corner of the frame, just for a moment, there was a shadow moving independently of anything visible on camera. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, but it was definitely there. A dark shape that moved with purpose, tracking parallel to my path across the garage. Marcus went quiet, his previously skeptical expression replaced by something more serious. He made a copy of the footage and filed a report, but we both knew it wasn't much to go on. A shadow on a security camera could be anything. A technical glitch, a reflection, an optical illusion created by the camera angle and lighting. But I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what I felt. I don't park on level 4 anymore. I've started using the street parking near my building, even though it means feeding meters and walking further. I've changed my work schedule, leaving earlier when there are still other people around, other cars in the garage, other signs of normal human activity. But sometimes late at night when I'm walking from my apartment to my car, I still hear them. Those footsteps that match my pace exactly, that stop when I stop and start when I start. And sometimes when I glance in my rearview mirror, I catch a glimpse of a dark sedan maintaining a careful distance behind me. I still have the security footage on my phone. I've watched it dozens of times, frame by frame, trying to understand what that shadow was and where it came from. But the more I analyze it, the more questions I have and the fewer answers I find. The handprint on my passenger window stayed there for 3 days before I finally worked up the courage to clean it off. But I took photos first, measurements, detailed documentation of something I couldn't explain and couldn't ignore. Marcus told me to trust my instincts, that 30 years in security had taught him that people usually know when they're being watched, even if they can't prove it. He said the best defense against that kind of threat is awareness and unpredictability. Changing routines, staying alert, never making yourself an easy target. I follow that advice now. I vary my schedule, take different routes, park in different places. I carry pepper spray and keep my keys between my fingers when I walk alone at night. I've become hypervigilant about my surroundings, constantly scanning for anything that feels out of place or wrong. But I still hear those footsteps sometimes. And I still wonder who made that handprint on my car and why they wanted me to know they'd been there. I wonder if they're still watching, still following, still waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. I wonder if I'll ever feel safe walking alone in a parking garage again. Story 2. The maintenance man who wasn't there. I was standing in the building manager's office, describing a man I'd seen nearly every day for a month, when Janet looked at me like I'd described a ghost. She pulled out her employee roster, flipped through maintenance contractor records, even called the company that services our elevator systems. 20 minutes later, she hung up the phone and told me what I already knew deep down, but hadn't wanted to admit. There was no maintenance worker matching that description. There never had been. The service elevator he'd been working near had been sealed shut for 5 years after a fatal accident, and the keycard access to that area had been disabled. But I'd seen him. I'd nodded at him. And yesterday, when I found that rusty toolbox in the storage room with my apartment number scratched into the metal, I realized he'd been seeing me too. I live in the Riverside Apartments, a converted warehouse building downtown that's about 80 years old. It's the kind of place that attracts young professionals who want to live in the city but can't quite afford the luxury high-rises. The rent is reasonable, the location is convenient, and most of the time it's a pretty good place to call home. The building has character, exposed brick walls, high ceilings, those old industrial windows that let in lots of natural light. The parking garage is in the basement, carved out of what used to be the building's loading dock and storage areas. It's not pretty. Concrete floors stained with decades of oil and antifreeze. Fluorescent lights that buzz constantly. That particular damp smell that comes with being underground. But it's secure, included in the rent, and during Chicago winters, having covered parking is worth its weight in gold. I'd been living there for about 6 months when I first saw him. It was a Tuesday evening in late September, and I was coming home from work around 7:30. I parked in my assigned spot, number 23, and was gathering my things from the back seat when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. There was a man in coveralls standing near the far corner of the garage, next to what looked like a service elevator I'd never really paid attention to before. He was maybe 55 or 60, medium build, wearing those gray work coveralls that maintenance people always seem to wear. He had a toolbox at his feet and appeared to be examining something on the elevator door. When he saw me looking, he gave a brief nod, not friendly exactly, but acknowledging. The kind of impersonal greeting you might exchange with someone you see regularly but don't actually know. I didn't think much of it. Old buildings require constant maintenance, and it made sense that there would be workers down there periodically fixing things that tenants never even know are broken. I nodded back, grabbed my purse and laptop bag, and headed for the main elevator that takes residents up to their apartments. Over the next few weeks, I saw him regularly. He was always in the same area, always wearing the same gray coveralls, always focused on some task involving that service elevator. Sometimes he'd have different tools, a flashlight one day, what looked like electrical testing equipment another day. He never spoke to me beyond that brief nod, and I never felt compelled to start a conversation. In a city like Chicago, you learn to mind your own business, especially when it comes to building maintenance issues that don't directly affect you. But after about 3 weeks, I started noticing things that felt off. First, he was always there. Not just frequently, always. Morning, evening, weekend, weekday, it didn't matter. Every time I went to the garage, he was standing in that same corner, working on that same elevator. I began to wonder what kind of project could possibly take that long, and why the building management would approve such extensive work in the middle of tenant parking hours. Second, I never saw him arrive or leave. I'd come down to get my car and he'd be there. I'd return an hour later and he'd still be there in exactly the same position, as if he hadn't moved at all. I never saw a work truck or van, never saw him carry tools in or out, never witnessed him actually making progress on whatever he was supposed to be fixing. Third, he never seemed to have the right tools for the job. One day he'd be holding a screwdriver while staring at what was clearly an electrical panel. Another day he'd have electrical equipment while examining what looked like a mechanical door mechanism. It was like watching someone pretend to work without actually knowing what the work was supposed to accomplish. The thing that really started bothering me, though, was the way he watched the residents. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but as the weeks passed, I became more aware of his behavior patterns. When someone would enter the garage, he'd pause whatever he was pretending to do and observe them. Not obviously, he was subtle about it, using his peripheral vision, glancing up briefly as if checking who was there. But he was definitely tracking people's movements, noting their schedules, learning their routines. I started paying closer attention to the other residents when I encountered them in the garage. Did they see him too? Did they think his constant presence was normal? But most people seem to move through the space without really noticing anything beyond their own cause in the elevator. City living teaches you to develop selective awareness. You see what you need to see and filter out the rest. About a month after I first saw him, my keycard stopped working. I was coming home from a late dinner with friends around 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, when I discovered that my keycard wouldn't open either the main garage entrance or the elevator inside. I tried it several times, checking to make sure I was using the right card, but the red light just kept blinking at me. The building has a night security line that residents can call for after-hours issues, so I used my cell phone to contact the service. The person who answered took my information and said they'd send someone down to help me, but it might be 20 or 30 minutes because their maintenance staff was dealing with another issue elsewhere in the building. I decided to wait in the garage rather than on the street, so I used the emergency stairwell to get inside. The garage was dimmer than usual. Several of the fluorescent lights were either burnt out or flickering, and it felt more cavernous and echo-prone than I'd remembered. My footsteps seemed to bounce off the concrete walls in strange ways, creating the illusion that someone else was walking around down there. I was standing near my car, checking my phone for messages when I remembered the maintenance man. I looked over toward his usual corner, expecting to see him working on that service elevator, but the area was empty. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't there. That should have been reassuring, but instead it made me more nervous. His absence felt wrong somehow, like walking into a room where you know something has been moved, but you can't identify what. I found myself scanning the entire garage, looking behind pillars and parked cars, trying to spot him somewhere else in the space. That's when I noticed that the service elevator was open, not just unlocked, actually open, with the doors spread wide and the interior visible. I could see that it was larger than the main elevator, designed for moving equipment and supplies rather than people. The walls were bare metal and there was a distinct smell coming from inside, something musty and stale, like air that had been trapped for a long time. I knew I should stay put and wait for the building's maintenance person to arrive, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked over to the service elevator, staying a few feet back from the entrance, and peered inside. The elevator car looked old and industrial, with buttons that were different from the main elevator system. But what caught my attention was the control panel. Several wires were hanging loose and there were tool marks on the metal housing, like someone had been trying to access the internal mechanisms. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around quickly, expecting to see the building's official maintenance person, but it was him, the man in gray coveralls, emerging from behind one of the concrete support pillars. He was carrying his toolbox and walking directly toward me with a purposeful stride that felt completely different from his usual passive presence. "Elevator's been giving us trouble," he said, and his voice was rougher than I'd expected, with an accent I couldn't quite place. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how isolated we were in the garage, how far I was from the main elevator and stairwell. "I didn't realize anyone was still working down here this late," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I work all kinds of hours. Building maintenance never stops, you know." There was something in the way he said it that made my skin crawl. He set down his toolbox and moved closer to the service elevator, positioning himself between me and the main exit route. I realized that in all the weeks I'd seen him, this was the first time he'd actually spoken to me. The first time he'd acknowledged me as more than just another tenant to nod at. I asked, taking another step back and angling myself toward the emergency stairwell. "Access issues," he said, running his hand along the door frame. "Key card readers, security protocols, that kind of thing." The way he said it made my blood run cold. I thought about my malfunctioning key card, about how convenient it was that I'd been stranded in the garage at the exact moment he decided to reveal himself and start a conversation. I thought about all those weeks of watching him pretend to work, and I realized that maybe the work hadn't been pretentious at all. Maybe he'd been studying the building's security systems, learning how to control access points, figuring out how to trap residents in isolated areas. I heard the ding of the main elevator and turned to see a man in a building maintenance uniform stepping out, carrying a legitimate-looking set of tools and wearing an official ID badge. The real maintenance person had arrived, When I looked back toward the service elevator, the man in gray coveralls was gone. Not walking away. Gone. Like he'd vanished into thin air, taking his toolbox with him. The service elevator doors were closed, and there was no sign that anyone had been standing there just moments before. The building maintenance worker helped me reset my keycard and get back to my apartment, but I spent the rest of the night wide awake, thinking about what had just happened. The next morning, I went to the building management office and described my encounter to Janet, the property manager. That's when I learned the truth that I'd been refusing to see. There was no maintenance project involving the service elevator. There was no contractor assigned to work in the garage during evening hours. The service elevator itself had been decommissioned 5 years ago after a fatal accident involving a previous tenant, and access to that area was supposed to be permanently restricted. Janet showed me the building's maintenance records, contractor agreements, and security protocols. There was no authorized work happening in the parking garage, no one who matched the description of the man I'd been seeing for weeks. She even pulled up the security footage from the previous evening, but the cameras in that corner of the garage had been malfunctioning for months, a technical issue they'd been trying to get resolved through their security company. But I saw him, I kept insisting, every day for weeks. Janet looked through more records, made more phone calls, even contacted the building's former management company to see if there might be some confusion about inherited contracts or ongoing projects. Nothing. No record of any maintenance worker, no documentation of any elevator repair project, no explanation for what I'd witnessed. The worst part came when she showed me the service elevator itself. We went down to the garage together, and she used her master key to access the restricted area. The elevator doors were sealed with industrial adhesive and covered with warning notices that had been there for years. There was no way someone could have been working on it, no way the doors could have been open the previous night. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd experienced. Janet suggested that I might have seen someone who wasn't supposed to be in the building. Someone who had gained unauthorized access and was using the garage for purposes that had nothing to do with maintenance. She filed a security report and arranged for additional camera coverage in that area, but she also recommended that I consider whether stress or fatigue might have played a role in my perceptions. I wanted to believe her alternative explanations. I wanted to think that maybe I'd been confused, that maybe the man I'd seen was real but not who he appeared to be, that maybe there was some logical reason for everything I'd experienced. But 3 days later, I found the toolbox. I was doing laundry in the basement storage area, which is adjacent to the parking garage, when I noticed something metallic tucked behind the water heater. It was a rusty red toolbox, old and dented, with what looked like years of accumulated grime. But scratched into the metal lid, in rough, uneven letters, was the number 23, my apartment number. Inside the toolbox were tools I didn't recognize, strange implements that didn't seem designed for any legitimate maintenance purpose. There were also photographs, dozens of them, all taken in the parking garage, all showing residents walking to and from their cars, including several photos of me. I called the police and they took the toolbox as evidence, but there were no fingerprints, no way to trace where it had come from or who had left it there. The photos had been taken with an instant camera, so there was no digital metadata, no way to determine when they'd been shot or by whom. The investigation went nowhere, but the detective assigned to the case told me something that still keeps me awake at night. He said that in his experience, people who go to the trouble of documenting other people's routines and movements are usually building up to something more serious. He said the fact that my apartment number had been marked on the toolbox suggested that I'd been specifically targeted, that someone had been studying me with a particular purpose in mind. I moved out of the Riverside apartment 6 weeks later. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still down there in that garage, still watching, still waiting. Even though Janet increased security patrols and installed additional cameras, even though the police had documented the incident and were supposed to be monitoring the situation, I never felt safe parking in that basement again. Sometimes I drive past the building on my way to work and I find myself looking down at the garage entrance, wondering if he's still there. I wonder if other residents have started noticing a maintenance worker who shouldn't exist, working on projects that were never authorized, watching them with eyes that hold too much interest and too much knowledge about their daily routines. I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in the garage longer that night, if the real maintenance worker hadn't arrived when he did, if I'd been alone with him in that isolated space for just a few more minutes. I wonder who he really was and what he was planning to do with all those photographs. And sometimes late at night when I'm parking in my new building's garage, I catch myself scanning the shadows and corners looking for gray coveralls and a rusty toolbox, listening for footsteps that shouldn't be there. Story 3. I heard scratching coming from inside a parked van. The scratching stopped the moment I froze. Complete silence, like whatever was inside that van knew I was listening. I stood there in the empty mall parking garage, my car keys cutting into my palm, staring at this white cargo van that had been sitting in the same spot for days. Then it started again. Slow, deliberate scraping against metal, followed by what sounded like fingernails dragging down the interior walls. I should have run. I should have called someone. Instead, I took a step closer, and that's when I heard the voice. The van is still there. I drive past it every day, and I can't stop thinking about who I left behind. I'm not someone who usually notices things like parked cars or pays attention to what's been sitting where for how long. Most people aren't, I think. You develop this kind of selective blindness when you're just trying to get through your day. Park your car, run your errands, get back home. But level B3 of Northgate Mall is different from other parking areas. It's always nearly empty, which is exactly why I like it. Most shoppers park on level 1 or 2, closer to the mall entrances, and B3 is far enough down that people avoid it unless they're specifically looking for space during peak holiday times. The lighting is dimmer than the upper levels, and there's this persistent echo that makes every sound feel amplified and hollow. But it's convenient for me because I work at the Barnes & Noble in the mall, and I can usually park close to the employee elevator that takes me straight up to the store level. I'd been working there for about 8 months, mostly closing shifts, so I was familiar with the late evening atmosphere in the parking structure. After the mall closes at 9, the garage becomes this strange, liminal space, too bright to feel completely abandoned, but empty enough that your footsteps echo off the concrete walls in unsettling ways. The van first appeared on a Saturday in early November. I noticed it because it was the only other vehicle on the entire level when I came down after my shift. White cargo van, no windows on the sides or back, nothing particularly distinctive about it except that it was parked in a spot near the far wall, away from the elevator and stairwell areas where employees usually leave their cars. I figured someone was probably moving apartments or transporting something large, and they'd chosen B3 because it offered more space to maneuver. The next day, the van was still there. Same spot, same position, like it hadn't moved at all. I thought maybe someone had left it over the weekend, that they'd pick it up on Monday when whatever business they were dealing with reopened. Mall parking has a 72-hour limit, but security doesn't usually enforce it unless someone complains or the structure gets crowded. But Monday came and went, and the van remained. By Wednesday, I was starting to pay more attention to it. Not because I was particularly concerned, but because it was becoming this fixture in my daily routine, this constant presence in an area that was usually transient. Every day when I came down after work, there it was, occupying the same space, looking exactly the same as it had the day before. That's when I started noticing the details that should have bothered me from the beginning. The van had no license plates, front or back, just empty mounting brackets where plates should have been. The windows, what few there were, had this heavy tint that made it impossible to see inside, even during the day when the parking garage's fluorescent lights were at their brightest. And there was a thin layer of dust accumulating on the hood and windshield, suggesting it really had been sitting there for days without being moved. I asked Marcus, one of the mall security guards, about it during my break on Thursday. He's a friendly guy in his 40s who's been working security there for years, and he usually knows what's going on with any unusual situations in the parking areas. He said, pulling out his phone to check something. Yeah, I've got a note about that. Someone called it in a few days ago, said it might be abandoned. That should have been the end of it. Problem identified, solution in progress, nothing for me to worry about. But when I went down to the garage that evening after closing, something felt different. I was walking toward my car, my footsteps echoing in the empty space, when I heard something that made me stop mid-stride, scratching. It was subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss as the building settling or some mechanical noise from the ventilation system. But as I stood there listening, it became more distinct, more rhythmic. Slow, deliberate scraping sounds like something or someone was dragging their fingernails across metal. The sounds were coming from the direction of the van. I stayed perfectly still, trying to convince myself I was imagining things, that the acoustic properties of the parking garage were making me hear sounds that weren't really there. But the scratching continued, and it was definitely coming from inside the van. Not from the engine area or the undercarriage, but from the cargo space, like something was trapped inside and trying to get out. My first thought was that it might be an animal. Maybe someone had been transporting a dog or cat and the animal had been left behind when the van was abandoned. That would explain the scratching, and it would mean I needed to call security immediately to get help for whatever was trapped inside. But as I listened more carefully, the scratching didn't sound random or frantic the way an animal's clawing would. It was too methodical, too controlled, like someone was trying to communicate rather than simply trying to escape. I took a step closer to the van and the scratching stopped immediately. The silence was more unsettling than the sound had been. It suggested awareness, intelligence, the ability to detect my presence and respond accordingly. An animal might pause if it heard approaching footsteps, but this felt different. More calculated, more human. I waited for about 30 seconds, not moving, barely breathing. Then the scratching started again, but now it had a different rhythm. 3 short scrapes, 3 long ones, 3 short ones again. Over and over in the same pattern. I realized it was Morse code, SOS. My heart started racing as the implications hit me. Someone was inside that van, someone who was trying to signal for help using the only method available to them. This wasn't an abandoned vehicle, it was a prison. I pulled out my cell phone to call 911, but I discovered I had no signal in the parking garage. The underground location and concrete construction blocked most cellular reception, something I'd never really thought about before because I usually didn't need to make calls from down there. I had 2 choices: run back to the mall to get help, or try to communicate with whoever was inside the van first. If someone was really trapped in there, if they'd been there for days without food or water. Every minute could be critical. But if this was some kind of trap, if someone was using distress signals to lure people closer to the van, then approaching it could put me in serious danger. The scratching continued, still in that same SOS pattern, and I made my decision. I walked closer to the van, stopping about 6 feet away from the rear doors. I called out, keeping my voice low but audible. The scratching stopped immediately, replaced by what sounded like frantic movement inside the cargo area. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, muffled and weak but unmistakably human. "Help me," it said. It was a woman's voice, hoarse and desperate, with the kind of exhaustion that comes from days of calling out with no response. I could hear her moving around inside the van, probably trying to get closer to wherever my voice was coming from. "I'm going to get help," I told her. "No," she said, and there was panic in her voice. "Don't leave, he comes back," I asked. "The man who put me in here, he checks on me. If he sees anything suspicious, he'll take me somewhere else." I approached the rear doors of the van and tried the handles, but they were locked. The woman inside was right up against the doors now, and I could hear her more clearly. I asked, "I don't know, days, maybe a week. I was walking to my car at night and someone grabbed me. I examined the door mechanisms, looking for any way to force them open, but they appeared to be secured from the outside with some kind of additional locking system beyond the standard van locks. I would need tools or professional help to get them open safely." "Listen to me," I said. "I have to go get help. The police, the fire department, someone with the right equipment to get you out safely." She cried, and I could hear her hitting the doors from inside. "He has cameras. He watches. If you bring police, he'll see them coming and he'll drive away with me still inside." I was torn between wanting to help her immediately and knowing that I wasn't equipped to handle this situation alone. But her fear about the perpetrator returning and moving the van made sense. If someone had been keeping her prisoner for days, they were probably monitoring the situation carefully, ready to relocate if they detected any threat. I asked, "Find something to break the lock," she said. "Anything heavy, anything sharp. There's a toolbox in the maintenance area near the elevator." I knew the area she was talking about. A small utility room where the mall maintenance staff kept supplies for the parking garage. It was usually unlocked during business hours, and there might be something there that could help me force open the van doors. I ran to the utility room, and sure enough, there was a toolbox containing various implements that the cleaning crew used for garage maintenance. I grabbed a large wrench and a pry bar, then ran back to the van. The woman was still talking to me from inside, guiding me toward the best approach for attacking the lock mechanism. She seemed to know something about how the doors were secured, suggesting she'd spent considerable time examining her prison from the inside. I worked on the locks for about 10 minutes, using the pry bar to create leverage and the wrench to hammer against the weakest points. The sound echoed through the empty garage in a way that made me constantly worried about attracting unwanted attention, but the woman kept encouraging me to continue. Finally, something gave way. The rear doors of the van swung open and I found myself staring into the cargo area. It was empty, completely, utterly empty. No person, no evidence that anyone had ever been inside. No sign of the woman I'd been talking to for the past 20 minutes. The interior smelled like cleaning chemicals and new plastic, like it had recently been detailed. I stood there for a long moment trying to process what I was seeing. The voice had been so clear, so desperate, so real. I'd heard her moving around, heard her hitting the doors, heard her giving me specific information about tools and lock mechanisms. I called into the empty space. Silence. I climbed partway into the van, looking for hidden compartments, false walls, anywhere someone could be concealed, but it was just a standard cargo van with nothing unusual about its construction. No place to hide, no evidence that anyone had been trapped inside. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see a man in a mall security uniform walking toward me, holding a radio and looking concerned, but it wasn't Marcus. This was someone I'd never seen before, older and heavier, with an expression that seemed more suspicious than helpful. He asked, stopping about 10 feet away from the van. "I heard someone calling for help from inside," I said, climbing back out. He looked at the open van doors, then back at me. I know that now, but I heard her voice. The security guard spoke into his radio, reporting the situation to someone else, then approached the van and examined the damaged door mechanisms. He shined a flashlight into the cargo area, confirming what I already knew, that it was completely empty. Then he took down my information and told me that the police would probably want to speak with me about the property damage, but the police never contacted me. When I came to work the next day, the van was gone, and Marcus told me that the owner had finally come to pick it up. He said the security report mentioned someone had broken into it, but there was no evidence of kidnapping or false imprisonment, so the matter had been dropped. I tried to explain what I'd heard, tried to describe the woman's voice and her specific knowledge about the locks and tools, but Marcus just looked at me with the kind of expression you give someone who's clearly been under too much stress. "Those parking garages can play tricks on your mind," he said. "Sound bounces around in weird ways down there, especially late at night when you're tired." I wanted to believe his explanation. I wanted to think that I'd made an honest mistake, that stress and fatigue had made me misinterpret sounds that had innocent explanations, but I know what I heard. I know that someone was in that van, someone who knew specific details about how the doors were secured and where to find tools in the parking garage. Someone who was terrified of being moved to another location before help could arrive. I still park on level B3. And I still think about that van every day when I walk past the spot where it used to sit. I wonder if the woman I heard was real, and if so, what happened to her when the van was moved. I wonder if she's still trapped somewhere, still calling for help that never comes. I wonder if I should have stayed on the phone with 911, should have insisted that police respond immediately, should have done something differently that might have saved her. And sometimes late at night when I'm walking alone through that parking garage, I hear scratching sounds coming from behind concrete pillars, and I find myself stopping to listen, hoping I'll never hear that desperate voice again, but terrified that someday I will. Story 4. My parking spot was always taken by the same empty car. I stood in the building management office holding a photograph of my own parking spot, pointing at the silver sedan that had been sitting there for 2 months, while Janet told me the spot was empty and registered only to me. She pulled up live security footage on her monitor, showed me the same parking spot from 3 different camera angles, and in every single feed, spot 214 was vacant. But I could see the car. I was looking right at it, and when I finally worked up the courage to peer through the dusty windows last week, I saw photos scattered across the dashboard, dozens of them. Photos of my building, photos of my car, photos of me walking to and from that exact parking spot, taken from inside the vehicle that apparently didn't exist. I've lived at Meridian Commons for 3 years now, and I've always had the same assigned parking spot. Level 2, spot 214. It's a good location, not too far from the elevator, not too close to the entrance where you get a lot of traffic noise, right in that sweet spot where you can park quickly and get to your apartment without much hassle. The parking garage is covered and secure, which was one of the main selling points when I decided to rent here. The building is fairly new, maybe 8 years old, and it caters to young professionals who want modern amenities without the premium prices of the luxury high-rises downtown. The parking garage is well lit, cleanly maintained, and equipped with security cameras throughout. It's the kind of place where you feel safe walking alone, even late at night. In 3 years of living here, I'd never had any issues with my parking spot being occupied by someone else's vehicle. The building management is pretty strict about parking assignments, and they're quick to tow unauthorized cars. Residents get assigned spots when they sign their lease, and those assignments don't change unless someone moves out or requests a transfer. So when I came home from work on a Monday evening in late August and found a silver sedan parked in my spot, my first reaction was mild annoyance rather than alarm. These things happen occasionally. Visitors who don't understand the parking system, new residents who haven't learned their assigned spots yet. Honest mistakes that get sorted out quickly. The car was a mid-sized sedan, silver or light gray, maybe 5 or 6 years old. Nothing particularly distinctive about it, no unusual markings or modifications. The kind of car you'd see thousands of in any major city, completely unremarkable and forgettable. It was parked properly within the lines, not blocking anyone else's access, positioned exactly where my car should have been. I parked in a visitor spot temporarily and went upstairs to call building management. The after-hours service took my information and said they'd have someone check on it first thing in the morning, possibly arrange for towing if the vehicle was there illegally. Standard procedure for parking violations. But when I went down to move my car to my assigned spot the next morning, the silver sedan was still there. Same position, same appearance, like it hadn't moved at all overnight. I called building management again, spoke to Janet in the leasing office, and she said she'd look into it personally. She asked me to describe the vehicle and provide the license plate number, which I realized I hadn't thought to check the previous evening. That's when I noticed the first thing that should have bothered me. There were no license plates. Not just missing plates, but empty mounting brackets where plates should have been. Front and back, the car had the hardware for displaying registration tags, but no actual plates were attached. In a state that requires both front and rear plates, this was a significant violation that should have attracted immediate attention from parking enforcement. I reported this to Janet, and she assured me that security would investigate the situation and have the vehicle towed if necessary. She also mentioned that she'd check their records to see if any residents had recently registered a silver sedan in case there was some confusion about parking assignments. But when I came home from work that evening, the car was still in my spot. I was starting to get frustrated. I'd been parking in visitor spots for 2 days, which was inconvenient and technically against building policy for residents. I'd reported the issue multiple times and building management seemed to be taking it seriously, but nothing was being done to resolve the situation. I decided to take a closer look at the vehicle myself. I walked around the car, noting details that might be useful for security or law enforcement. It was definitely a silver sedan, maybe a Honda Accord or Toyota Camry with what appeared to be several years of normal wear and tear. The windows were tinted dark enough to make it difficult to see inside, but not so dark as to be illegal. There was a thin layer of dust on the hood and roof, suggesting it had been parked there for at least a few days. What struck me as odd was how clean and well-maintained it looked despite the dust accumulation. The paint was in good condition, the tires appeared to be relatively new, and there were no visible dents or scratches. It looked like someone's primary vehicle, not an abandoned car that had been left behind. I tried peering through the windows to see if there were any clues about who owned it or why it was parked in my spot, but the tint made it impossible to make out any details of the interior. All I could see were vague shapes and shadows that could have been anything. By the end of the week, I was seriously annoyed. The car had been in my assigned spot for 6 days. I'd made multiple calls to building management, and nothing had been resolved. I was paying for covered parking as part of my rent, and I wasn't getting what I was paying for. I decided to escalate the issue. I went to the leasing office in person and demanded to speak with Janet about the situation. She pulled up my account on her computer and confirmed that spot 214 was definitely assigned to me, that there were no other vehicles registered to that space, and that there was no record of anyone requesting a parking assignment change. "Let me check the security footage," she said, pulling up the building's camera system on her computer. She accessed the feeds from level 2 and scrolled through several days of footage, focusing on the area around spot 214. I watched over her shoulder as the timestamp moved through the days in question, showing my parking spot at various times. That's when I experienced something that I still can't adequately explain. On the security footage, parking spot 214 was empty, completely consistently empty. The camera showed my spot as vacant during all the times when I knew for certain that the silver sedan was parked there. I watched myself on the security footage, walking past my empty parking spot to park in visitor areas, looking frustrated and confused, but there was no car in the space. "I don't understand," I said. "The car is there right now." Janet looked out the leasing office window, which provides a view of part of level 2. "I don't see any car in your spot," she said. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. From the leasing office window, spot 214 appeared empty. But I knew the silver sedan was there because I'd walked past it on my way into the building just 10 minutes earlier. I asked. Janet agreed, probably thinking that seeing the empty parking spot would resolve my confusion and end what she was beginning to consider a waste of her time. We took the elevator down to level 2 and walked toward my assigned spot. The silver sedan was right there, exactly where it had been for the past week. But Janet acted like she didn't see it. She walked directly to spot 214, gestured at the empty space and said, "See? No car." I stared at her in disbelief. She was standing right next to the sedan, close enough to touch it, and she was talking about an empty parking space. The car was clearly visible to me, solid and real and undeniably present, but she was behaving as if it didn't exist. "Janet," I said carefully, "there's a silver sedan parked right there." She looked around the area with the expression of someone indulging a person with obvious mental health issues. "I don't see any car here. Are you feeling okay?" I reached out and touched the car's hood, feeling the solid metal and accumulated dust under my fingers. "I'm touching it right now." Janet watched me appear to touch empty air, and her expression shifted from patience to genuine concern. "Maybe you should go upstairs and rest." I spent the next hour trying to convince her that the car was real, pointing out details, describing its appearance, even suggesting that she touch it herself. But from her perspective, I was having an animated conversation with empty space, gesturing at nothing, describing a vehicle that didn't exist. Finally, she suggested that I might benefit from talking to someone professionally about what I was experiencing, and she went back upstairs to the leasing office. I stayed in the parking garage for a while longer, walking around the sedan, examining it from every angle, trying to understand what was happening to me. The car was absolutely undeniably real. I could see it, touch it, even smell the faint odor of exhaust and motor oil that comes from any vehicle. But apparently I was the only person who could perceive it. Over the next few weeks, I developed a routine of checking on the sedan every day, documenting its presence, trying to gather evidence that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. I took photographs with my phone, but when I looked at them later, they showed an empty parking spot. I tried to take video with the same results. The footage showed me walking around empty space, talking to myself. But the car remained visible to me, and it never moved from spot 214. I started paying closer attention to its details, looking for clues that might explain what was happening. The dust accumulation changed over time, suggesting that the car was exposed to the same environmental conditions as everything else in the garage. Sometimes there would be water spots from the building's sprinkler system, sometimes leaves or debris that had blown in from outside. About 6 weeks after I first noticed the car, I decided to try looking inside more carefully. I approached the driver's side window and cupped my hands against the glass to block out reflected light. The interior was dusty but otherwise normal. Cloth seats, standard dashboard, nothing unusual or remarkable. But scattered across the dashboard were what looked like photographs. I moved to different windows, trying to get a better view of the interior, and eventually I was able to make out enough detail to understand what I was seeing. There were dozens of photographs spread across the dashboard and front seats, and they all seemed to be related to my building and my daily routine. Photos of the Meridian Commons exterior, photos of the parking garage from various angles, photos of my car in different locations, and photos of me walking to and from the parking garage, entering and leaving the building, going about my daily activities. Someone had been watching me, documenting my movements, studying my routines, and somehow they'd been doing it from inside a car that only I could see, parked in the exact spot where I was supposed to park every day. I tried to open the car doors, but they were locked. I considered breaking a window, but I was worried about what the consequences might be if I damaged property that other people couldn't perceive. How do you explain breaking the window of an invisible car? How do you justify actions taken against something that doesn't officially exist? Instead, I started changing my routine. I began parking in different areas of the garage, taking different routes to and from my apartment, varying my schedule as much as possible. I hoped that if someone was really watching me from inside that sedan, making myself unpredictable might discourage their surveillance or force them to reveal themselves in some way. But the car never moved from spot 214, and the photographs inside continued to accumulate. I consulted a therapist about what I was experiencing, describing the situation without mentioning the supernatural elements, focusing on the stress and anxiety of feeling watched and documented. The therapist suggested techniques for managing paranoia and hypervigilance, but didn't offer any explanations for why I might be seeing a car that wasn't visible to others. I also researched psychological conditions that might cause visual hallucinations, but nothing I found matched my experience. The sedan wasn't a fleeting glimpse or a vague shape. It was a detailed, consistent, interactive hallucination that persisted across multiple senses and maintained continuity over months. 3 months after I first noticed the car, I moved out of Meridian Commons. I couldn't continue living in a place where I felt constantly watched by someone I couldn't identify, someone who had access to a surveillance position that no one else could see or acknowledge. Even if the car was some kind of hallucination, the photos inside it suggested that someone was really documenting my activities, really studying my routine for purposes I didn't want to think about. I never told Janet the real reason I was breaking my lease early. I cited work-related relocation, paid the penalties, and found a new apartment across town. But sometimes I drive past Meridian Commons and I always slow down when I pass the parking garage entrance. I wonder if the silver sedan is still parked in spot 214. I wonder if it's watching someone else now, collecting new photographs, studying new routines. I wonder if the next tenant in my old apartment has started noticing a car that only they can see, a car that comes with a history of surveillance and a dashboard full of evidence that no one else will ever be able to verify. And I wonder if someday I'll understand what I really saw in that parking garage, or if it will always remain this inexplicable violation of reality that followed me for months and changed the way I think about safety, privacy, and the nature of being watched. Story 5. I found a trail of blood leading to my vehicle. The blood was still wet when I found it, fresh enough to glisten under the parking garage's yellow lights, forming a thin trail of droplets that led directly from the elevator to my car. I followed it with my eyes, my heart pounding as I realized the trail didn't just lead to my vehicle. It ended at the driver's side door, where a bloody handprint was smeared across the handle like someone had tried to hold on while falling. The police found nothing when I called them. No body, no witnesses, no explanation for where the blood had come from or who had left it there. But I know what I saw. And I know that someone had been at my car, someone who was bleeding, someone who needed help that never came. I go to a lot of late-night movies by myself. It's one of those habits you develop when you're single and don't want your social life to be limited by other people's schedules. Thursday night is usually my movie night. Tickets are cheaper, theaters are less crowded, and I can see whatever I want without having to negotiate with anyone about genre preferences or showtimes. The Regency Cinema is a 15-screen multiplex about 20 minutes from my apartment, and it has one of those massive parking structures that serves not just the theater but also several restaurants and retail stores in the same complex. During peak hours, the garage can be completely full, but late at night, especially on weekdays, most levels are nearly empty. I prefer parking on the top level, level 5, because it's open air rather than enclosed. There's something about being able to see the sky and feel air circulation that makes me more comfortable than being trapped in the lower levels with their artificial lighting and recirculated ventilation. The top level also tends to be the most deserted, which means I don't have to worry about other cars boxing me in or people loitering around the area. On this particular Thursday in late October, I'd gone to see a 10 o'clock showing of a horror film that had gotten good reviews. The movie was better than I'd expected, and I stayed through the credits, so it was nearly midnight when I finally left the theater. The complex was mostly shut down by then. Most of the restaurants close by 11 on weeknights, and the retail stores had been closed for hours. I took the elevator up to level 5, expecting to find the usual nearly empty expanse of concrete and parked cars scattered randomly across the available spaces. The elevator doors opened with their familiar ding, and I stepped out into the familiar yellow-tinged lighting of the parking structure. That's when I saw it. There was a trail of what looked like dark liquid drops on the concrete floor leading from the elevator area toward the far side of the garage. In the artificial lighting, it was hard to tell exactly what color it was, but something about the way it reflected light made my stomach clench with instinctive dread. I followed the trail with my eyes, and my heart started pounding when I realized where it led. The droplets formed a clear path across the concrete, spaced about 18 inches apart like someone had been walking while dripping fluid from a wound. The trail led directly to the area where I'd parked my car, a dark blue Honda Civic that I'd left in one of the spots near the far wall. I stood by the elevator for a moment trying to decide what to do. Every instinct told me to get back in the elevator, go back down to the theater lobby and call security. But my car keys were in my purse, my phone was almost dead, and I needed to get home. Besides, whatever had happened was probably over by now. The trail looked like it had been there for a while. I started walking toward my car, following the trail of drops, trying to convince myself that it was probably something innocent. Maybe someone had spilled a drink, or dropped something that had leaked as they carried it to their vehicle. Maybe it was motor oil from a car with a leak, or some other automotive fluid that had dripped as someone moved their vehicle, but as I got closer, the drops became more distinct, and I could see that they were definitely red. Not the black or brown color of motor oil, not the clear or colored appearance of spilled beverages. This was red with the thick consistency and particular way of reflecting light that made it unmistakably blood. The trail led directly to my car, not just to the general area where I'd parked, but specifically to my vehicle ending at the driver's side door, and there, smeared across the door handle, was a bloody handprint. It was clearly a human hand. I could see the distinct outline of fingers and palm, the way the blood had been dragged downward as if someone had tried to maintain their grip while sliding down the side of the car. The print was larger than mine, suggesting it had been left by someone with bigger hands, probably a man. I stood about 6 feet away from my car, staring at the handprint, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had been bleeding, had walked from the elevator area to my specific vehicle and had touched my door handle while losing enough blood to leave a clear trail across the concrete. I pulled out my phone to call 911, but discovered that my battery was almost dead, and I had very poor cellular reception in the parking garage. I needed to get to a landline or find someone else who could make the call for me. But first, I had to understand what had happened here. I walked around my car carefully, looking for other signs of blood or disturbance. The handprint on the driver's side door was the most obvious evidence, but there were also a few smaller smears on the rear bumper and what looked like fingerprint marks on the rear passenger window. Someone had definitely been using my car for support, possibly trying to stay upright while dealing with a significant injury. I checked the ground around my vehicle for any other clues. The blood trail ended at my car, but there was no indication of where the injured person had gone from there. No additional drops leading away from the vehicle, no signs that someone had collapsed nearby. It was as if they had reached my car and then simply vanished. The trunk of my car was still locked, and I could see through the rear windows that the interior appeared normal. No one was hiding inside, no evidence that anyone had gained entry to the vehicle itself, but the exterior showed clear signs that someone had used it as support while bleeding profusely. I decided I needed to get help immediately. I walked back to the elevator, taking care not to step on any of the blood drops, and rode down to the theater lobby. Most of the lights were off, but there was a security guard making his closing rounds, and he agreed to call the police and paramedics while I waited. Officer Martinez arrived about 15 minutes later, followed by a paramedic unit and a crime scene technician. I led them up to level 5 and showed them the blood trail and the handprint on my car door. Officer Martinez asked, taking notes in a small notebook. Around 9:45, when I parked it before the movie, I said. The crime scene tech took photographs of the blood trail and the handprint, then used a chemical test to confirm that it was indeed human blood. The paramedic examined the quantity and pattern of drops, trying to determine how serious the injury might have been. Based on the volume and distribution, the paramedic told Officer Martinez, this person was bleeding steadily from what was probably a moderate to serious laceration. Officer Martinez interviewed me about whether I'd seen anyone suspicious in the theater or parking garage, whether I'd had any recent conflicts or problems that might have led to someone targeting my vehicle, whether I recognized the handprint or had any idea who might have left it there. I couldn't provide answers to any of those questions. I'd been alone at the movie, hadn't noticed anyone paying particular attention to me, and had no enemies or ongoing disputes that would explain why someone would seek out my car while injured. The police searched the entire parking structure, checking every level for signs of an injured person, evidence of violence, or any other clues that might explain what had happened. They found nothing. No body, no witnesses, no additional evidence beyond what was on and around my car. The crime scene tech collected samples of the blood for DNA analysis and dusted my car for fingerprints. But Officer Martinez warned me that without a suspect or a victim, there wasn't much they could do with whatever evidence they gathered. It's possible someone was injured in an accident or altercation elsewhere, he said, and they came here looking for help, maybe because they saw your car and thought you might be nearby. That explanation made sense, but it didn't account for why someone would specifically seek out my car, rather than going to the theater lobby or one of the restaurants, all of which would have been better places to find help. It also didn't explain why there was no blood trail leading away from my vehicle. The police report was filed as a suspicious incident, but without a victim or evidence of a crime, there was no active investigation. I was given a case number and told to contact them if I remembered anything else or if there were any additional incidents. But the incident wasn't over. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. The image of that bloody handprint on my door handle was burned into my memory, and I found myself constantly checking my car for any signs that someone had been near it. I started parking in different areas of various parking structures, avoiding the top level of the Regency Cinema garage entirely. But no matter where I parked, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting for another opportunity to approach my vehicle. About a week later, I found another clue. I was cleaning out my car, organizing the trunk and checking under the seats for trash or forgotten items, when I discovered something that made my blood run cold. Wedged between the rear bumper and the license plate holder was a small piece of fabric, a torn strip of what looked like a white t-shirt, stained with dried blood. The fabric hadn't been there before the incident at the movie theater. I was certain of that because I'd cleaned my car thoroughly just a few days earlier, and I would have noticed something so obviously out of place. Someone had left it there, either deliberately or accidentally during their encounter with my vehicle. I took the fabric to the police and Officer Martinez added it to the evidence file, but he reiterated that without additional information or similar incidents, there wasn't much they could do with a piece of bloody cloth. He asked, "Maybe they tore their shirt trying to bandage a wound, and a piece got caught on your bumper." I wanted to believe that explanation, but something about the whole situation felt too deliberate, too specific to be random. The way the blood trail led directly to my car, the handprint positioned exactly on the door handle, the fabric left behind like a calling card. It felt like someone was trying to communicate something, or leave evidence of their presence for me to find. 3 weeks after the original incident, it happened again. I was leaving work late on a Tuesday evening, walking to my car in the parking structure beneath my office building, when I noticed fresh blood drops on the concrete. Not a trail this time, just a few scattered drops near my vehicle, but clearly recent and clearly in the same area where I'd parked. This time, there was no handprint on my car, but there was something else that made my skin crawl. Tucked under my windshield wiper was a small piece of paper folded multiple times and stained with what looked like blood. I called the police immediately, and Officer Martinez met me in the parking garage to examine the new evidence. The paper contained a brief message written in shaky handwriting. "Thank you for your help." The police dusted my car for fingerprints again and collected the note for analysis, but the results were inconclusive. The handwriting was too distorted to identify, and there were no clear prints on the paper beyond smudged marks that could have been made by anyone. This suggests that whoever left the blood at the movie theater was genuinely seeking help, Officer Martinez said, and they interpreted your car as some kind of assistance, even though you weren't there. But I hadn't done anything. I'd found evidence of their presence after the fact, called the police, and provided information for their investigation. I hadn't provided any actual help to anyone, and I certainly hadn't been present when they were injured and bleeding. I started researching similar incidents online, looking for cases where people had found unexplained blood trails leading to their vehicles, but I couldn't find anything that matched my experience. There were plenty of stories about vandalism, break-ins, and other crimes involving parked cars, but nothing about injured strangers using specific vehicles as reference points or support systems. The psychological impact of these incidents has been significant. I've become hyper-vigilant about my car and my surroundings, constantly checking for signs that someone has been near my vehicle, constantly wondering if I'm being watched or followed by someone I've never seen. I've also become obsessed with the idea that I somehow missed helping someone who genuinely needed assistance. The note suggested that this person believed I had helped them, but I can't figure out how or when that might have happened. Maybe my presence in the area, even though I was in the movie theater, somehow provided them with the security or confidence they needed to seek medical attention elsewhere. Or maybe there's something about my car, my routine, or my behavior that attracts people in crisis situations. Something that makes them see me as a potential source of help even when I'm not available. I don't go to late-night movies alone anymore. I don't park in isolated areas of parking structures, and I always make sure my phone is fully charged before I go anywhere that might leave me stranded without communication options. But I still think about that bloody handprint, about the person who left it there, about what happened to them after they walked away from my car. I think about the note thanking me for help I never provided, and I wonder if there's some way I could have actually assisted them if I'd been there at the right time. I wonder if they're okay now, if they got the medical attention they needed, if they're still out there somewhere thinking about the night they left their blood on a stranger's car door. And I wonder if I'll ever understand why they chose my car, why they felt I was someone who could help them, and what I was supposed to do with the evidence they left behind. To Story 6. The couple who watched me from their car. The woman smiled at me through the windshield, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made every hair on my arm stand up. The kind that said she knew something about me that I didn't know she knew. They'd been sitting in that dark blue sedan for 45 minutes, engine off, just watching me walk back and forth from the gym to my car. When I finally decided to confront them, to ask what they wanted, the man in the driver's seat slowly shook his head and held up his phone. On the screen was a photo of my apartment building. My apartment building, taken from an angle that could only mean they'd been there too, watching me there too. I got in my car and drove away, but when I looked in my rearview mirror, they were following me. I joined CrossFit Central about 8 months ago, partly for fitness and partly because I was tired of working out alone at home. The gym is in a converted warehouse about 15 minutes from my apartment, and it has this community atmosphere that makes exercising feel more social and less like a chore. Most of the classes I attend are in the early evening, around 6:30 or 7. Which means I'm usually leaving around 8:15 when the parking lot is still reasonably busy but starting to thin out. The parking lot is shared between the gym and a few other businesses: a physical therapy clinic, a small accounting firm, and a dog grooming service. During the day, it's usually full, but by evening, most of the spaces are empty except for gym members and the occasional late appointment at one of the other businesses. I started noticing them about 6 weeks ago. They were sitting in a dark blue sedan, a mid-size car that looked like it was probably a Honda or Toyota, maybe 4 or 5 years old. Nothing unusual about the vehicle itself, but what caught my attention was that they were just sitting there. Engine off, both of them in the front seats, not talking. Not looking at phones, not doing anything except sitting in silence. At first, I thought they were waiting for someone. Maybe they were picking up a family member who was finishing a workout, or waiting for one of the other businesses to close so they could have a meeting or appointment. But as I loaded my gym bag into my car and drove away, I noticed they were still there, still sitting in the same positions. The next evening, they were there again. Same car, same parking spot near the entrance to the lot, same 2 people sitting silently in the front seats. This time I paid more attention to them as I walked from the gym to my car. The driver was a man probably in his 40s with dark hair and a beard. The passenger was a woman similar age with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. They were both dressed casually, like they were just ordinary people running errands or waiting for something ordinary to happen. But they weren't looking at each other, weren't engaged in conversation, weren't displaying any of the normal behaviors you'd expect from people who were waiting together. Instead, they seemed to be watching the parking lot, observing the people coming and going from the various businesses. I started to feel like they were watching me specifically. It's hard to explain what made me think that, because they weren't staring, obviously, or doing anything overtly suspicious. But there was something about the timing of their presence, the way they always seemed to be there when I arrived and still there when I left, that made me increasingly uncomfortable. After about a week of seeing them regularly, I decided to test my suspicions. I changed my workout schedule, attending a morning class instead of my usual evening session. The parking lot was busier in the morning, filled with people going to work and appointments at the various businesses. But the dark blue sedan wasn't there. That evening, I drove past the gym without stopping, just to see if they would be in the parking lot at the usual time. Sure enough, there they were, sitting in the same spot, apparently waiting for something that never arrived. The next day, I went back to my regular evening schedule, and they were there again. This pattern continued for several weeks. Every time I came to the gym for my usual classes, they were in the parking lot. Every time I changed my schedule or skipped a workout, they weren't there. It became clear that their presence was somehow connected to my routine, that they were tracking my schedule in ways that suggested deliberate surveillance. I started paying more attention to their behavior during my workouts. Through the gym's front windows, I could see the parking lot clearly, and I began watching them while I exercised. They never got out of their car. They never appeared to eat or drink anything. They just sat there, occasionally adjusting their positions but never leaving the vehicle or engaging with anyone else. Sometimes other gym members would park near them, and I would watch to see if the couple showed any interest in these other people. But they seemed focused exclusively on monitoring who came and went, not on any specific individual except apparently me. About 3 weeks ago, I decided to confront them directly. I finished my workout around 8:30, but instead of walking directly to my car as usual, I approached their vehicle. As I got closer, I could see them more clearly through their windshield. The man was older than I'd initially thought, maybe late 40s or early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he spent time outdoors. The woman was probably in her early 40s, with sharp features and pale eyes that seemed to track my approach with predatory interest. I stopped about 6 feet from their car and waited for them to acknowledge me. The man looked at me with an expression of mild curiosity, like he was wondering what I wanted but wasn't particularly concerned about my presence. The woman, however, smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, calculating, and somehow knowing, like she was amused by something I didn't understand. The smile never reached her eyes, which remained fixed on my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I called out loud enough for them to hear through their closed windows. The man slowly shook his head, but he didn't break eye contact. Instead, he held up his phone so I could see the screen. Displayed on the phone was a photograph of my apartment building, taken from the street at an angle that showed both the main entrance and the parking garage where I keep my car. My heart started racing as the implications hit me. They hadn't just been watching me at the gym. They'd been to my home, had photographed where I lived, had been conducting surveillance on multiple aspects of my daily routine. I backed away from their car, pulled out my own phone, and started to dial 911. But the woman held up her phone as well, and on her screen was a photo that made my blood run cold. It was a picture of me sleeping. The photo had been taken through my bedroom window, sometime when my curtains weren't fully closed, showing me lying in bed completely unaware that I was being observed. The image quality suggested it had been taken with a telephoto lens from a considerable distance, but it was clear and detailed enough to be unmistakably me. I ran to my car, fumbling with my keys as panic set in. They had been inside my apartment building or close enough to photograph me through my windows. They had been watching me sleep, documenting my most private and vulnerable moments. I got in my car and immediately drove out of the parking lot, checking my rearview mirror constantly. The dark blue sedan followed me. They maintained a careful distance, staying 3 or 4 cars behind me, but they were definitely following my route. When I turned, they turned. When I changed lanes, they eventually changed lanes. When I pulled into a gas station to see what they would do, they parked across the street and waited. I called 911 from the gas station and tried to explain what was happening, but the dispatcher seemed skeptical about my claims that a couple was stalking me. Without evidence of threats or actual crimes, there wasn't much the police could do about people sitting in a parking lot or driving on public roads. The dispatcher asked. "They showed me photos," I said. "Did they say anything threatening about the photos?" I had to admit that they hadn't spoken to me at all, hadn't made any explicit threats or demands. From a legal standpoint, taking photos in public spaces isn't necessarily illegal, and even the photo of me sleeping might be difficult to prosecute if it was taken from a public area outside my building. But I knew I was being stalked, and I knew these people had access to information about my private life that they shouldn't have. I spent the next 2 hours driving around the city, taking random turns and doubling back on my route, trying to lose them. Eventually, I thought I'd succeeded. I didn't see the dark blue sedan in my mirrors for about 20 minutes, and I cautiously drove home. But when I pulled into my apartment building's parking garage, they were already there. They were parked in a visitor spot, engine running this time, waiting for me to arrive. The woman was smiling that same cold smile, and the man was holding his phone up again, though I couldn't see what was on the screen from that distance. I didn't park. I drove straight through the garage and back out onto the street, then spent the night at a friend's house across town. The next morning, I contacted building security about unauthorized people in the parking garage, and I filed a formal police report about stalking and possible breaking and entering. The police took my statement and said they would increase patrols in my area, but they warned me that proving stalking can be difficult when the perpetrators are careful not to make direct threats or intrude in obviously illegal behavior. I also installed security cameras in my apartment and changed all my locks, though I had no evidence that they'd actually gained entry to my living space. For the past 3 weeks, I've been varying my routine as much as possible. I work out at different times, take different routes to and from destinations, and try to be unpredictable in my daily activities. But I still see them occasionally. The dark blue sedan parked in different locations around my neighborhood. The same 2 people sitting silently in the front seats. Last week, I saw them at the grocery store where I usually shop. They were in the parking lot when I arrived, and they followed me inside, maintaining distance but staying within sight as I went through the aisles. They didn't approach me or speak to me, but their presence felt like a constant reminder that my privacy had been violated, that my daily life was being monitored by people with unknown intentions. I've started carrying pepper spray and considering a restraining order, but my lawyer says that without evidence of direct threats or illegal behavior, it would be difficult to get a court order against people who claim they're just exercising their right to be in public spaces. The most unsettling part is that I still don't know what they want. They've never tried to contact me directly, never made demands or threats, never indicated what their purpose might be in conducting this surveillance. Are they building a case for some kind of legal action? Are they gathering information for someone else? Are they planning something more serious that requires detailed knowledge of my routines and vulnerabilities? I've researched private investigators and process servers, thinking they might be working on behalf of someone who has a legitimate legal interest in my activities. But I'm not involved in any lawsuits, don't owe money to anyone, and can't think of any reason someone would hire professionals to monitor me. I've also considered that they might be connected to someone from my past, an ex-boyfriend, a former co-worker, someone who feels they have reason to keep tabs on my life. but I can't think of anyone who would go to these lengths. And the level of sophistication in their surveillance suggests this is more than casual curiosity or personal grudges. The worst part is the feeling of constant vulnerability, the knowledge that these people have intimate details about my private life and daily routine. Every time I go to sleep, I wonder if they're outside my window with a camera. Every time I leave my apartment, I wonder if they're watching from somewhere I can't see them. I've started looking over my shoulder constantly, checking for dark blue sedans in every parking lot, scanning crowds for faces that might belong to the people who have been watching me for months. I've become paranoid and hypervigilant, unable to relax even in spaces that should feel safe. I don't know if they're still out there, still watching, still documenting my movements for whatever purpose they have in mind. I don't know if they'll eventually escalate their behavior, make contact, reveal what they want from me. But I know they changed my sense of safety and privacy in ways that may never fully heal. I know that somewhere out there, two people have files of information about me, photos of my most private moments, detailed knowledge of my vulnerabilities and routines. And I know that no matter how much I change my schedule or vary my activities, I may never be completely free from the feeling that someone is always watching, always documenting, always planning something I can't see coming. Story 7. I got locked in the parking garage overnight. The lights started going out one section at a time, moving toward me like something was hunting through the darkness. I was trapped on level 4 of my office building's parking garage, all the exits sealed from the inside, my phone completely dead, watching fluorescent fixtures die in sequence as something I couldn't see made its way through the shadows between parked cars. I spent 7 hours huddled in my vehicle, listening to footsteps that weren't mine echoing off concrete walls, watching shadows move past my windows in patterns that didn't make sense. When the gate finally opened at dawn and I drove out into daylight, I quit my job that same day. I never went back to that building, and I never told anyone what I heard moving through the dark during those endless hours when I was alone and trapped underground. I used to stay late at the office regularly. Not because I loved my job. I worked as a junior accountant for a mid-sized consulting firm, processing client files and reconciling financial records that weren't particularly interesting or challenging. But because I found the quiet environment after hours more conducive to focused work than the constant interruptions and office politics of normal business hours. Most of my coworkers left by 6 p.m., and by 7 or 8, the entire floor would be empty except for me, and occasionally 1 or 2 other people who also preferred working when the building was quiet. The cleaning crew usually came through around 9:30, and by 10 p.m., I was typically the only person left in our suite of offices. I'd been following this routine for about 18 months without any problems. The building management knew that some tenants worked late hours, and they'd arranged for keycard access to remain active until 11 p.m. for people who needed to stay after normal business hours. The parking garage stayed accessible until midnight, giving late workers plenty of time to finish up and get to their cars safely. On the night everything changed, I was working on a particularly complex audit that was due the following morning. The client had provided incomplete documentation, and I needed several additional hours to track down discrepancies and ensure all the numbers reconciled properly. It was the kind of detailed, time-sensitive work that required uninterrupted concentration. I'd planned to leave by 10:30, giving myself plenty of time to get to the parking garage before the midnight access cut off. But the audit was more complicated than I'd anticipated, and I kept finding issues that required additional analysis and documentation. Before I knew it, my desk clock showed 1:47 a.m., and I realized I'd been working for nearly 6 hours without taking a real break. I packed up my things quickly, turned off the office lights, and headed for the elevator. The building felt different at that hour, more silent, more cavernous, with the kind of emptiness that makes every small sound seem amplified and significant. The elevator ride down to the parking garage level seemed longer than usual, and I found myself checking my phone repeatedly, though I wasn't sure what I was looking for. When the elevator doors opened on level 4, where I always parked, I immediately noticed that something was wrong. The parking garage was darker than usual. Several sections of fluorescent lighting appeared to be turned off or malfunctioning, creating pockets of deep shadow between the remaining lit areas. My car was parked in one of the darker sections, and I had to use my phone's flashlight to navigate between the concrete pillars and parked vehicles. I reached my car without incident, but when I tried to drive to the exit, I discovered the first sign of a serious problem. The exit gate wasn't responding to my approach. Normally, the gate would detect my vehicle and lift automatically, or I could use my keycard at the reader to trigger the mechanism. But when I drove up to the gate, nothing happened. The barrier remained down and the keycard reader showed a solid red light that didn't change when I swiped my card. I tried several times getting out of my car to examine the gate mechanism and keycard reader, but nothing I did had any effect. The system appeared to be completely non-responsive, as if it had been shut down or was malfunctioning in some fundamental way. I pulled out my phone to call building security, but discovered that I had no cellular signal in the parking garage. This wasn't entirely unusual. The underground location and concrete construction often interfered with wireless reception, but it meant I couldn't get help without finding a landline or getting to an area with better cellular coverage. I decided to try the pedestrian exits. The parking garage had 2 stairwells that connected to the main building, plus an emergency exit that led directly to the street. I parked my car and walked to the nearest stairwell, but found that the door was locked from the inside. Not just locked with a keycard reader, actually locked with what appeared to be a deadbolt or security mechanism that I couldn't access from the garage side. I tried the second stairwell with the same result. The door was secured from the deed and there was no way to open it from the parking garage level. This seemed wrong. Fire safety regulations should have required that emergency exits remain accessible from both sides. But I was trapped nonetheless. The emergency exit to the street was also locked, secured with a heavy-duty mechanism that showed no signs of responding to my keycard or any other method I could think of. I was completely trapped in the parking garage. I walked back to my car, trying to remain calm while I considered my options. The building probably had some kind of emergency protocol for situations like this, and there might be a manual release for the gate system or a way to contact security from inside the garage. I just needed to find the right controls or communication devices. That's when the lights started going out. It began in the far corner of level 4, the section farthest from where I was parked. A row of fluorescent fixtures simply went dark all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. Then the next row went out, and the next, creating an expanding area of darkness that seemed to be moving systematically through the garage. I got in my car and locked the doors, watching through my windshield as section after section of lighting was extinguished. The pattern wasn't random, it was too organized, too sequential, like something was deliberately shutting off the lights as it moved through the space. Within about 10 minutes, the darkness had consumed more than half the garage, leaving only a few scattered islands of fluorescent lighting. My car was still in one of the lit areas, but I could see that the progression was heading in my direction. I tried my phone again, hoping that the cellular towers might provide better reception if I moved to a different part of the garage, but I still had no signal. The battery was also running low. I'd been using the flashlight earlier, and the constant searching for signal was draining power quickly. As the lights continued to go out around me, I became aware of other sounds in the garage. At first, it was just the mechanical hum of ventilation systems and the occasional settling noise that concrete structures make as temperature changes cause slight expansion and contraction. But gradually, I began to hear sounds that didn't have innocent explanations. Footsteps, not my own. I was sitting in my car with the engine off, not moving. But the distinct sound of someone walking across concrete, their shoes echoing in the cavernous space. The footsteps seemed to be coming from the darkened areas of the garage, moving slowly and deliberately between parked cars. I strained to see anything in the areas where the lights had gone out, but the darkness was complete. No emergency lighting, no residual illumination from outside, no way to determine what was causing the sounds I was hearing. The footsteps continued for several minutes, sometimes pausing, sometimes changing direction, always staying within the darkened sections where I couldn't see their source. They had a purposeful quality, like someone was searching for something or patrolling the area methodically. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of a car door opening and closing. It came from somewhere in the darkness, followed by the brief illumination of dome lights from a vehicle I couldn't locate. Someone else was in the garage, someone who had access to a vehicle, someone who was moving around in the areas where the lights had been systematically extinguished. I started my car and turned on the headlights, hoping to illuminate some of the darkened areas and get a better sense of what was happening around me. But my headlight beams didn't penetrate very far into the darkness, and the concrete pillars created deep shadows that could conceal anything. I sat in my car with the engine running, headlights on, doors locked, trying to decide what to do next. I could try driving around the garage, using my headlights to search for other people or alternative exits. But that would mean leaving the relative safety of the lit area and venturing into sections where I couldn't see potential threats. Instead, I decided to wait and hope that whatever was happening would resolve itself, or that building security would eventually check the garage and discover my situation. But the waiting turned into hours. I watched my dashboard clock move from 2:15 a.m. to 3:00 a.m. to 4:30 a.m., sitting in my running car listening to footsteps and mysterious sounds coming from the darkness around me. Sometimes the sounds would stop for long periods, making me think that whoever else was in the garage had left. Then they would resume, closer than before, as if something was gradually working its way toward my location. Around 4:00 a.m., I saw lights moving in the darkened areas. Not the fluorescent ceiling lights coming back on, but flashlight beams or handheld lights being carried by someone moving between the parked cars. The lights would appear briefly, sweep across concrete walls and pillars, then disappear again, leaving me with no clear sense of where they were coming from or who was carrying them. I tried honking my horn several times, hoping to attract attention from building security or indicate my presence to whoever else was in the garage. But the horn blasts just echoed off the concrete walls and there was no response from the darkness. By 5:00 a.m., my car was running low on gas and my phone battery was completely dead. I was exhausted from hours of hypervigilant anxiety, but I didn't dare fall asleep when I couldn't see what was happening around me and didn't know who else was sharing the space. The footsteps continued intermittently, sometimes accompanied by other sounds I couldn't identify. Scraping noises, metallic clanks, what sounded like doors opening and closing on vehicles I couldn't see. It was as if a whole community of people was going about their business in the darkened sections of the garage, invisible to me, but clearly aware of my presence. Around 6:30 a.m., I started to see the first hints of daylight filtering in through the few small windows near the garage's vehicle entrance. The natural light didn't illuminate much, but it provided enough additional visibility for me to feel slightly less trapped and vulnerable. At exactly 7:00 a.m., The exit gate opened. I didn't see anyone operate it, didn't hear any mechanical sounds that would indicate someone was manually controlling the system. It simply lifted, as if it had been programmed to resume normal operation at a specific time. I drove out of the garage immediately, not stopping to investigate the darkened areas or search for explanations of what I'd experienced. I just wanted to get out of that underground space and back into normal daylight where the world made sense again. When I reached my apartment, I sat in my car for another 20 minutes, trying to process what had happened and decide whether I should report the incident to building management or the police. But what would I report? That I'd been trapped in a parking garage overnight due to what appeared to be a system malfunction? That I'd heard sounds that might have been other people, but I'd never actually seen anyone? That lights had gone out in a pattern that seemed deliberate, but could have been caused by electrical problems? None of it sounded credible when I tried to articulate it objectively. And I had no evidence beyond my own testimony of an experience that could be explained by equipment malfunctions, acoustic tricks, and the psychological effects of spending hours alone in a dark, confined space. I called in sick to work that day and spent the time researching my employment contract and considering resignation options. By evening, I'd made my decision. I drafted a resignation letter citing personal reasons, cleaned out my desk remotely by asking a co-worker to pack my belongings, and never returned to that building. I found a new job within a month, working for a smaller firm in a different part of the city. I made sure my new workplace had reliable after-hours access policies, backup power systems, and multiple exit options that couldn't be simultaneously compromised by equipment failures. But I still have nightmares about that night in the parking garage. I dream about being trapped in darkness while invisible footsteps circle my car, about lights going out in patterns that suggest intelligence and purpose, about spending hours in a liminal space where the normal rules of safety and access don't apply. I've never been able to determine what really happened that night. Was it a system malfunction that trapped me during maintenance work being performed by night crews I couldn't see? Was it a security test or building inspection that I inadvertently became part of? Or was it something more sinister, some kind of deliberate entrapment that I escaped only because whatever was planned for me wasn't completed before dawn? I don't have answers to those questions, and I've stopped looking for them. What I know is that I spent 7 hours trapped in a space that should have been safe, surrounded by sounds and activities that I couldn't see or explain, feeling hunted by something that remained hidden in the darkness. And I know that I'll never again stay late in an office building. Never again trust that emergency exits will function when I need them. Never again assume that I'm alone in a space just because I can't see anyone else. Some experiences change your fundamental understanding of safety and vulnerability, and that night in the parking garage was one of them. Story 8. Someone left a note on my windshield every day for a month. The note on day 30 was different from all the others. Instead of the usual folded paper tucked under my wiper blade, this one was sealed in a plastic bag with something else inside, my spare car key. The key I keep hidden in a magnetic box under the rear bumper. The key that was definitely there yesterday morning when I checked it before leaving for work. The note said, "I've been inside." My hands were shaking as I read it, standing in the parking garage while other people walked past like nothing had happened. But something had happened. Someone had been inside my car, had access to it for who knows how long, had been watching me closely enough to know my routines and vulnerabilities. And I still had no idea who they were. I noticed the first note on a Tuesday morning in late September, folded neatly and tucked under the passenger side windshield wiper of my Honda Civic. It was just a small piece of white paper, the kind you might tear from a notebook, with a simple smiley face drawn in blue ink. Nothing else. No words, no other markings, just that childlike drawing of a circle with 2 dots and a curved line. My first thought was that it might be from a kid in the apartment complex where I live. Maybe someone's child had been playing in the parking garage and decided to leave little drawings on cars as a game or art project. It was harmless enough, and actually kind of sweet in an innocent way. I threw the paper away and didn't think much about it. The next morning, there was another note. The handwriting was neat, but had a slightly shaky quality, like someone writing carefully to make sure their message was legible. This gave me a moment of pause. The first note could have been random, but 2 notes suggested someone was specifically targeting my vehicle. Still, the message seemed benign. Maybe someone in the building was genuinely admiring my car and wanted to express their appreciation in an anonymous way. I mentioned it to my neighbor Kelly when I saw her in the hallway that evening. "Someone's been leaving little notes on my car," I said. She laughed. That seemed like a reasonable explanation. Anonymous notes were probably better than some of the alternative ways people express interest. At least whoever was leaving them wasn't being creepy or invasive. But the notes kept coming. The messages were becoming more personal, more specific to my behavior and habits rather than just my vehicle. Someone wasn't just admiring my car, they were observing my daily activities, paying attention to my schedule, studying my patterns in ways that felt increasingly uncomfortable. I started looking around the parking garage more carefully, trying to identify who might be watching me. The building has about 60 units, and the underground parking garage serves most of the residents plus some visitors. During morning and evening hours, there are usually several people coming and going, but I'd never noticed anyone paying particular attention to me or my car. I also started varying my routine slightly, leaving at different times, taking different routes to and from my parking spot, trying to determine if whoever was leaving the notes would adjust their behavior accordingly. The notes continued to appear every morning, regardless of what time I left or returned. The level of detail was becoming disturbing. These weren't casual observations from someone who occasionally saw me in passing. They were specific behavioral notes that suggested sustained surveillance. Someone was watching me closely enough to notice small habits and routines that I wasn't even consciously aware of. I reported the incidents to building management, and they agreed to review security footage from the parking garage cameras. But the building manager, Dave, called me back that afternoon with frustrating news. "The cameras covering your parking area have been malfunctioning for about 2 weeks, he said. "We're waiting for a replacement part to get them back online. Without camera footage, there wasn't much building management could do beyond increasing their general awareness of potential problems." Dave suggested that I document the notes and consider contacting the police if the messages became threatening or if I felt unsafe. But the notes weren't explicitly threatening. They were just uncomfortably personal and invasive. The tone was shifting from observation to concern, like whoever was writing them felt they had some kind of relationship with me or responsibility for my well-being. The messages suggested emotional investment that went beyond casual interest or admiration. I started parking in different areas of the garage, hoping to disrupt whatever system the note writer was using to access my car. But no matter where I parked, the notes continued to appear. Now the messages were explicitly acknowledging my attempts to evade surveillance, and they carried an undertone of persistence that felt more threatening. Someone was making it clear that they could find me regardless of what defensive measures I took. I contacted the police and filed a report about stalking and harassment. Officer Kim took my statement and collected the notes I'd saved. But she warned me that anonymous messages weren't necessarily criminal, unless they contained explicit threats or demands. She asked, I had to admit that all contact had been through the notes and none of the messages had contained threats of violence or specific demands for action. From a legal standpoint, someone leaving anonymous notes on a car in a public parking area wasn't necessarily a crime. "Keep documenting everything," Officer Kim advised. "If the messages escalate or become more threatening, we can consider stalking charges. Whoever was leaving the notes had observed my interaction with the police and was responding directly to my attempts to get help. This suggested they were watching me more closely than I'd realized, possibly following me or monitoring my activities beyond just the parking garage. The realization that my stalker was aware of my efforts to stop them made me feel even more vulnerable and isolated. They were demonstrating that they could track my movements, observe my interactions with authorities, and remain undetected despite increased scrutiny. I installed a small motion-activated camera in my car, pointing it toward the windshield area where the notes usually appeared. If someone was approaching my vehicle regularly, the camera should capture footage that could be used to identify them. But when I reviewed the footage each morning, there was nothing. No person approaching my car, no evidence of anyone placing notes on the windshield. Yet the notes continued to appear. The note writer was aware of my surveillance efforts and was apparently skilled enough to avoid detection by a motion-activated camera. This suggested a level of planning and technical knowledge that made them seem more dangerous and sophisticated than I'd initially assumed. I started sleeping poorly, constantly worried about who was watching me and how extensively they were monitoring my life. Every time I left my apartment or returned home, I found myself scanning the parking garage and surrounding areas, looking for anyone who seemed out of place or overly interested in my activities. The messages were commenting on my physical appearance and emotional state in ways that suggested continued close observation. Someone was noting the effects their harassment was having on me and expressing mock concern about problems they were creating. I considered moving to a different apartment, but my lease had another 8 months remaining, and breaking it would involve substantial financial penalties. I also wasn't certain that relocating would solve the problem. If someone was determined enough to conduct this kind of sustained surveillance, they might be willing to follow me to a new location. Instead, I started staying at friends' houses occasionally, using rideshare services instead of driving my own car, and generally trying to disrupt my routines enough to make continued surveillance more difficult. But the notes kept appearing on my windshield regardless of whether I'd driven the car recently or where I'd spent the night. My stalker was tracking my movements even when I wasn't using my regular transportation or following my normal schedule. They knew where I was staying, how I was getting around, and were making it clear that my defensive measures weren't effective. I felt completely exposed and vulnerable, like every aspect of my daily life was being monitored by someone with unknown intentions and apparently sophisticated surveillance capabilities. The 29th note contained the first direct suggestion that the pattern might change, that whoever was watching me was planning to escalate their behavior in some way. The promise that tomorrow will be different felt ominous and threatening. I almost didn't go to my car on day 30. I seriously considered calling in sick to work, staying in my apartment and avoiding the parking garage entirely. But I couldn't hide indefinitely, and I needed to know what different meant in the context of my stalker's plans. When I reached my car that morning, I immediately saw that something had changed. Instead of a folded piece of paper tucked under my windshield wiper, there was a small plastic bag secured to the wiper blade with tape. Inside the bag was a note and something else, a metallic object that made my heart race when I realized what it was. My spare car key, the key I kept hidden in a magnetic box attached to the underside of my rear bumper. in case I ever locked myself out of the vehicle. The key that was supposed to be my secret backup, known only to me and secured in a location that would be difficult for anyone else to discover. The note inside the plastic bag said, "I've been inside." My hands were shaking as I read those words, standing in the parking garage while other residents walked past on their way to work, completely unaware of the violation I was discovering. Someone had found my spare key, someone had been inside my car, had access to it whenever they wanted, had probably been using it as their private space for who knows how long. They'd been able to search through my belongings, examine my personal items, maybe even hide inside and wait for me to return. I immediately called the police, and Officer Kim met me in the parking garage to examine the evidence. She took photographs of the note and the key, and we searched my car together looking for signs of intrusion or tampering. Everything appeared normal. Nothing was missing, nothing was obviously out of place, no evidence that anyone had been inside. But that almost made it worse. It suggested that my stalker was careful, methodical, skilled at concealing their presence while conducting thorough surveillance. Officer Kim asked. I had no way to know. The spare key had been in its hiding place for months, and I rarely checked it unless I specifically needed to use it. Someone could have discovered it weeks or even months ago and been using it regularly without leaving obvious evidence. Officer Kim arranged for my car to be processed by a crime scene technician, looking for fingerprints or other forensic evidence that might identify the intruder. But the results were inconclusive. Too many overlapping prints and smudged marks to isolate anything useful. I had my car's locks changed and installed a more sophisticated alarm system, but the psychological damage was already done. Someone had been inside my personal space, had intimate access to my vehicle and belongings, had been able to observe me from closer range than I'd ever imagined. The notes stopped appearing after day 30, but that didn't make me feel safer. If anything, the silence was more unsettling than the daily messages had been. At least when I was receiving notes, I knew my stalker was maintaining distance and communicating through written messages. Now I had no idea what they were doing, whether they'd lost interest or were planning something more serious. I moved out of the apartment complex 6 weeks later, breaking my lease and paying the financial penalties because I couldn't continue living in a place where I felt constantly watched and vulnerable. I found a new apartment in a different part of the city, with assigned covered parking and better security systems, but I still check my car thoroughly every time I get in it. I look in the back seat, examine the interior for signs that anyone has been inside, test the locks and alarm system regularly. I've become hyper-vigilant about my surroundings, constantly scanning for anyone who might be watching me or following my routine. I never found out who was leaving the notes or how they managed to conduct such extensive surveillance without being detected. I never learned what their ultimate intentions were or why they chose me as their target. But I know that for 30 days, someone was documenting my life in intimate detail, learning my habits and vulnerabilities, gaining access to my personal space in ways I never detected until they chose to reveal themselves. And I know that somewhere out there, someone has detailed knowledge about me, my routines, my weaknesses, and my daily activities. Someone who demonstrated patience, skill, and dedication in their surveillance efforts. Someone who might still be watching, even now, from a distance I can't see, and using methods I haven't thought to detect.